ahead and get started, I think. 1 o'clock now. I just want to say a quick welcome and thank you for being here. My name is Jan Thomas. I'm with the Center for Technical Development, or the CTD, and we are happy to help host this Comet Farm introduction and demo workshop today. I'm going to just turn it straight over to Karen Hills with the Washington State Conservation Commission to set up our webinar today and introduce our speaker. Turn it over to you, Karen.
Hey, thanks, Jan. Nice to see some familiar names and faces here. I'm just going to try to set the stage a little bit before Haley gets going on the Comet Farm training. Most of the folks here are managing projects for sustainable farms and fields, or funded through the Sustainable Farms and Fields program. And as part of the reporting for those projects, we are asking most project managers to use Comet Farm to kind of dial in those estimates for CO2 equivalent impact of the projects. And so that's kind of the reason that Jan and I connected with Haley and had her here today, was to kind of get folks some training on the use of Comet Farm. I'm going to say, I guess, just right off the bat, that there are going to be some situations where Comet Farm is not going to be the tool that we'll use if you're managing a project that involves biochar application, if you have a TA only project, and there may be certain situations or certain crops that may not currently, you may not be able to use Comet Farm for. So when those situations come up, feel free to reach out to me and we'll talk about kind of what an alternative method is for making that estimate. And just a reminder, today's session is focused on the Cropland portion of Comet Farm. If you're managing a livestock project or an agroforestry project, there are trainings on the Comet Farm website that Haley hosts regularly that are more focused on those specific types of projects. I guess just another quick housekeeping note before I turn it over to Haley. We are going to have a kind of a troubleshooting type of session where folks can bring their, kind of any issues that they've run into in using Comet Farm to this forum. And Haley has graciously agreed to come back and help us work through some of those. So I'm going to be dropping that information into the chat, but it's going to be May 25th from 9 to 10 a.m. And we'll have Haley also hosts kind of regular office hours, and that's another way that you can work with her to get questions answered. When it's a simple question, I'm happy to do my best to help you, but I guess when we get into anything sort of deeper than surface level, I'll probably end up referring you to Haley. So I guess with that, I will turn it over to Haley, and you can introduce yourself. And I know you do a lot of these trainings, so we'll just let you take it away. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is actually the second training of the day. And my name is Haley Nagel, and I'm the Outreach and Education Specialist for the Comet Farm team. We actually have another outreach specialist on the team who is also joining this call. And so there are multiple of us now, with a lot more users these days. And so I primarily work to give these trainings and develop help tools to help users use the tools. And then a bunch of odds and ends jobs for the team as well. However, I am not a soil agronomist. So if you do happen to throw a curveball question at me, I'm happy to write that down if I don't know the answer, and then refer back to the experts on the team to get you guys the answers that you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I am pretty good at monitoring the chat as we go along. So if you have questions that come up while we're on certain sections throughout this training, feel free to drop those in and I can address them as we're going or where the answers would fit best. So I am on the Comet Farm homepage, and you are always greeted by this welcome window that usually outlines the most recent large updates, which the biggest update that came to the tool was last September, where we made the switch from the 20 centimeter DACENT model to the 30 centimeter DACENT model, which DACENT is going to be the primary or principal soil carbon and direct N2O emission model that is implemented in the tool. And so we just made the switch from looking at the top 20 centimeters to the top 30 centimeters, as well as using DACENT to now account for direct N2O emissions, whereas previously we were using the models that were outlined in the Blue Book document, which I will refer to throughout this presentation. And then I believe you all might have gotten an introduction video that I outlined in that as well. And so we're going to talk about that throughout this presentation as well. This welcome window will change in the next week or so. We're just going to be including a link for any projects that are associated with partnerships for climate smart commodities. But just be on the lookout for that every few times you log in if there are any major updates to the tool. And then on the homepage, we do also have a link to the COMET quarterly newsletter where we feature tips and tricks for the tool, as well as maybe a word from users who are using the tool and how they're using it if they'd like to share. We featured Carbon Cycle Institute in California, Shelburne Farms up in Vermont, some conservation planners in Wisconsin, and just really how they're using the tool if they would like to share. So you can access all of the past ones and any future ones from this little icon. And then Karen mentioned trainings and office hours that you can access through the little calendar icon, which takes you to the calendar training page where you can register ahead of time for the Wednesday office hours. You only have to register for one time and then you can just join the same link each time. And then I will be out of town starting on Thursday. So our training series starts back up May 4th. So you can register in advance for those here. And then what's also on this page is we do have a team email, which, oops, not that, which I and the new outreach specialist also monitor. So if you have questions, you can contact through here. You will likely have my email after this, so you can contact me through that. And then the other way is through this little need help widget. So when I go back to the home page, that little need help widget will follow you on every page of the COMET tools. So that will be on COMET Farm, COMET Planner, and COMET Energy if you're using that as well, which I've populated with over 100 different articles of frequently asked questions. So some commonly asked for questions or crops that we do not have in the tool, as well as crops that are available in the tool, as well as several other articles of frequently asked questions. And if you can't find the answer here and you forgot my email or the team email, you can contact us directly through this need help widget as well. And if you do happen to experience anything funky with the tool, maybe it's loading really slow or you're seeing something that you don't think you should be seeing, you can take a screenshot and send that directly to us too. That really helps get to the bottom of that. And then the last thing, a few other things on the homepage is I mentioned the Blue Book document, which is the USDA peer-reviewed methods document that COMET Farm was created in parallel with and as a function of. And so Karen mentioned that if you have, if you are looking to assess changes in biochar or biochar amendments between scenarios, that is not an option in the current COMET Farm because that is not a defined method in this Blue Book document. It might be included in the new updates. So the USDA is putting out a new peer-reviewed updated version of this document, which is actually going to public comment maybe by the end of this week, hopefully definitely by the end of next week. in which case it'll go through another review period, and then we'll have our hands on the final edited final copy by the end of summer, in which case we will implement those new methods into the tool. But in order for something to be included in Comet Farm, we do have to have those clearly defined methods in the Blue Book document. And unfortunately, biochar, I've gotten requests for pesticide emissions associated with that application. And those are not defined in the tool or in the Blue Book document at this time, but maybe in the near future. And then we also have the Comet Energy tool on Comet Farm homepage as well, which Comet Farm is not going to be a life cycle analysis tool. We are only looking at within what is considered the farm gate. So today we're looking at just the boundaries of the fields that you define in your Cropland project. Or if you're doing an animal ag project, we're looking at the boundaries of how many heads of cattle you define or swine. We're not looking at any upstream or downstream emissions, and no emissions associated with transportation or manufacturing. So if you are looking to assess any fuel-related emission reductions, you could use the Comet Energy tool, but just know it will not be attached to your Comet Farm project in any way or your Comet Farm account in any way. So just to put in context, if you were using the project that we're going to look at in a few minutes, where we're looking at cropland, maybe you're looking to assess intensive till to reduce till or no till, and you are using less fuel for that. The emissions that are associated with that fuel reduction will not be included in your Comet Farm report. You would need to use either Comet Energy or some other, I'm sure there are other fuel-related emission reduction calculation tools out there, but that will not be included in what we're looking at today. And so if we have time, I'll refer back to the Comet Energy tool and show you how that works too. So we're gonna get started using Comet Farm and click the big orange button. If you have not created a Comet Farm account, I would highly recommend it if you plan on using it at all. You are the only one who has access to that account unless you, one, share your login credentials, or two, if you generate a report, so you enter all the management, get to the end, have a report, then you can export, you can send that project to someone else who can then import it into their account. And that's the only way anyone will have access to your management that you add into Comet Farm. We follow the same privacy policies as USDA. And so I already have an account, so I'm just going to hop into that. The benefit of having an account is that you can access any and everything without it, but we will be able to return back to our projects later. Like I have all of these projects, which I should probably clean out sometime soon. But you can return back to this at any point in time. You can finish entering maybe details for one of 20 fields and then come back to it later and finish the rest of it, which you would not be able to do if you did not have an account. If you navigate away or close out your project without having an account, then it's gone. So I would recommend doing that. Your projects that you've created will live in this gray box area. We are going to I'm going to create a project live, but we do have what we call demo projects, which are sample projects that are already pre-populated with management that you would need to just generate a report, which gives you an idea of how to click through the tool without worrying about what management should or shouldn't be there. So we have a separate project for, you guys can see the top 5. So anything that has this little dev bubble next to it, you guys can't see that yet. Maybe one day, but at the moment you cannot. And so during the trainings that I do weekly, I usually look at one of these. But we are going to create a project live, mostly because I already did that one today and I'm looking for something a little different. So I'm actually going to create a new project, which is what you would also do if you are creating your own project. So I'm going to name said project, Washington sample. It does need to be short and sweet. So I'm going to create it, and then it will appear at the very bottom of your list. If you're new to Comet Farm, you probably won't have as many as me. But then when you navigate away and then come back to this page, it'll appear in alphabetical order. Now we need to select what type of accounting activity that we would like to assess. And so each of these accounting activities are entirely separate, as in they're each associated with a different chapter in the Blue Book. These, at this time, none of these methods and chapters interact with each other. So there's no overlapping methods. So we can add as many or as few of these as we want to one project, but they will all be, you will have separate data entry and a separate report for each of them. So today we're just going to do a Cropland project. But if you were doing both, you could enter both of these. And so that's all we're going to do for today. So I'm just going to say define activities. And now we are on the mapping page. So we need to define some fields to tie all of our management to. We are making that farm gate in order to provide a field specific analysis. Karen, would you be able to give me a zip code of somewhere nearby you?
Sure. I think Emmett's on this call from Mount Vernon. So how about 98273? That's the Mount Vernon zip code.
All right. Awesome. So I'm just going to pick a random field. I've never been to Washington State, so I have no idea what's going on in this field, but we're going to make up some management. So I like this field, but you could pick any field that you're looking to assess. And we need to define our Comet Farm calls them parcels. Just another way of saying field. I'm actually going to do this one. And there are 4 ways that you can add fields to your project. You can do a point, define a shape by polygon, by a circle, or you can upload a shape file. If you're doing a point, when you click on that, you're going to want to drop your point in the very center of that field. So if this is my field right here, I would want to drop that pin right in the middle of it. And then you would define your name, which you want this to also be short and sweet, especially when you get to the report page. F1 is fine for me for this case. And then define how many acres it is. And then you would say save location. I actually want to define this in a different way. I want to define my parcel by polygon. So I'm going to define the actual field boundaries of this field as close as possible to what it is. And we've got F1, you can name it whatever you want, field 1, and say save. The other ways that you can add a field, you could do a field by, or parcel by circle, where you just drag out the radius of that circle. I'm not going to do that either. Or you could upload a shapefile. If you're going to upload a shapefile, it is not the most intuitive process, which hopefully in our redesign that is happening later this year, that is simplified. But if you do intend to upload shapefiles, I do have a handy dandy how do I upload shapefile article in the need help widget that gives you step-by-step guidance on how to do that. And if you open this in the bigger page, you'll see an attachment with a sample shapefile if you wanted to try that out for yourself as well. I am not going to upload a shapefile at the moment, but you could if you wanted to. So we can just stick with this one field, but you can technically add up to 50 fields per project. And each field has a maximum size of 1,100 acres. I would not recommend uploading 50 1,100 acre fields to one project. I would stay in the max 15 to 20 fields per project. And the reason is because the more fields that you have, the more map units that are going to be assessed for it, or assessed with each of those fields. And you can look at how many map units that are included in your defined field by selecting this little soils button up top, which it wasn't working for me earlier today too. I think my computer's just being very slow. But normally, if you have, it was working on my other people's computer. When you click on soils here, you're going to get these little squiggly lines, which are the map units from the Cirgo soil database, which I just put in the chat. And Comet Farm does not allow users to upload their own soil data. So we're relying entirely on Cirgo for all the soil data information. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to turn off my volume on my other chat. That's going crazy, but I don't know how to do that. Okay, well, we'll go with it. And so normally you get those little red squiggle lines. And so this field might have 1 to, I don't know, probably max 4 map units for the entire field. And the entire, all of the methods, the DACIT model and those other methods that are included in the Blue Book are going to be run on every single map unit for every single field. So the more map units, the more fields, and the more scenarios you have, the longer it'll take to generate a report. And that is why I would recommend not going above 15 to 20 fields per project, because it will slow down the system. You could do it, it would be spinning for a while for you. And then you could get more soil information if you select on the view soil by click, and then you can click anywhere in your field, outside of your field, to get more soil information. A side note about defining your fields. If someone was to, for example, if they wanted to assess this, what looks like a baseball field, but if you were looking to assess a farm maybe, and assuming that this little non-agricultural region is like a barn, you would not want to define your field like this. You do not want to include any non-agricultural regions in your field definitions, because there's a very good chance that we do not have any soil data associated with this non-agricultural area, and it's going to throw an error message for you. So just make sure you are defining just the boundaries of where the crops that you're going to be assessing are in. And then the last thing is that if you had a parcel that you wanted to delete, you could delete those, or you could delete one at a time, or you can delete all of them. And if you do that, just be sure you want to do that, because once you delete your field, there's no going back. So you could technically delete your field after you've entered all your management, in which case it would be a very sad day. So just be sure you want to delete it if you're going to delete it. We are going to stick with just one field for this project. And I'm going to say done defining parcels, the big orange button. And now we have hopped from the parcel definition page to our historic management. Now we begin tying all of our management practices to the boundaries of the defined field. And so we need to fill out all of the historic management for all fields, which we only have one, but if you had more than one field, before you can move on to the baseline management scenario. And so if we had more than one field, you could zoom in and out and click on the different fields in this with this map. Or you could use the drop-down menu here and select those in order to fill out this management information. And so again, I've never been to Washington State, so I'm going to make some assumptions on this management. And maybe this was irrigated before 1980. And I'm going to assume that was not enrolled in CRP. And we're going to enter some management between 1980 and 2000 and enter the tillage that likely occurred between 1980 and 2000. I anticipate some questions being on what if we do not know the management before 2000. At this point, the best answer that I have is to try your best. The second best answer that I have is to reach out to maybe tribal communities or extension offices or other producers in the area for a general idea of what was likely happening before 2000. This management information is used to build the starting soil carbon stocks before we enter this actual management that we're going to be entering in a second. So it's not going to have a big impact, but it does have some impact on your report. So trying our best to get it as close as possible is the suggestion. If you have more than one field that is within the same county, and maybe all of the management was the same or very similar, you could copy this management from one field to another, which I only have one field, so I can't do that. But if you had more than one field, they would appear in this table below, and you could copy to multiple parcels if you wanted. And then the last thing on this page is this set baseline period. So in that introduction video that Karen sent out, we talked about a baseline scenario or a business as usual, what is currently happening on your operation. At this moment, Comet Farm will always begin your baseline in the year 2000, which there's a teeny tiny 2000 up here under the baseline. The baseline will always default to end the baseline timeline the year before the current year. So it's 2023, our baseline will go as default to 2022. You can change this baseline period default if you can change the end period. If you're looking to maybe retrospectively assess some sort of change in management. So say you had a producer who implemented cover crops in 2016, you could end the baseline period the year before that management change was implemented. For us, we're not going to do that, but if you wanted to, you could. So I am done defining my historic management. Remember, you guys can't see anything with the bubbles. And I'm just going to hit next. And now we are on the baseline management page, which it prompts you to add a crop rotation, but I'm going to show you this after I manually add something. So I can show you two different ways. So I'm going to say no thanks to that, and we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so we have hopped from historic management to baseline management. We have the same interactive map or the drop-down menu. You still have to fill out all management for all fields and all years before you can move to the scenario. We have 22 years, which I know is a lot, which I do have a fix for that, or at least a suggestion. But we have to fill out something in every year here before we can move on. Some sort of crop. That crop could be an orchard crop. It could be an annual crop, cover crop. And fallow counts as a crop in the eyes of Comet Farm at the moment. And so there are two ways that we can add a crop. We can add it manually, which is what we're going to do first. And then there is something called the drag and drop, which we'll get to in a second. So to add a crop manually, and again, I'm not super familiar with farming practices specific to Washington State, so I am just going to pick a sample corn. And so you can select from a list of crops in the drop-down menu. If you do not see the crop here, we do also have the cover crop options and an orchard crop. However, one of the limitations of Comet Farm is that not all crops are available for accounting in the tool. And this is due to limitations of DACENT, that principal soil carbon model. I did find, Karen, I do have a few papers that I can send to you to send out to the group about the parameterization process for getting crops into DACENT and therefore later into COMET. However, it is quite labor intensive and involves extensive data on management, carbon content, nitrogen content, residue, and some other management information in order to get that into DACENT. But I will send some introductory papers on that. But some crops are not available for accounting from the drop-down list, but we could offer a surrogate. For example, we do not have trit in the tool, but winter wheat is modeled similarly, so we would suggest that as a surrogate. Unfortunately, crops like squash or kale, we do not have a surrogate at the moment for that. So that would not be a crop that you could model in the tool. So then you would like to, or you would need to select a planting date in order to basically to tell the model that you have prompted and started the growth of this crop. And it is, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's likely not planted in February, and I'm going to say May. We'll go May 13th. And then, so this is May 13th in 2000. Unfortunately, most of the calendar widgets you cannot actually type in. You have to click on the date. And then we're going to add a harvest date. And I'm going to assume this was harvested maybe the last full week of August. Not entirely sure if that's what happens on the ground there, but we're going to go with it for this. And then you select if something was removed from said crop during the harvest, which in this case, we're removing the ear. You can enter a yield. However, with the yield, this yield will only impact your report if you have also included biomass burning. And that is because DACENT, that principal soil carbon model, will actually assume its own yield based off of the other parameters that you have entered. So based off of your planting dates, your harvest dates, the amount of fertilizer or just nitrogen additions that you add, and irrigation and water availability, DACENT will calculate its own yield and use that yield for any future calculations related to soil carbon. The yields that you enter here will only impact your report if you also have a burning event. Then you have the residue removal, which this is if you are removing anything in addition to like the ear of corn here. So we're going to assume we left everything on the field. You also have the option to add in a grazing event. But if you do not have animal agriculture added as one of the accounting activities that we selected earlier, you are going to get a warning that says you didn't do that, which is okay. If you do that, then if you don't add an animal ag event in here, but you have a grazing event, your cropland report will not include any enteric emissions, any emissions associated with housing and manure handling outside of being deposited on the pasture. So if you would like the full farm capture of those additional animal agricultural emissions, you will need to also include that animal ag accounting activity. So I'm going to get rid of this grazing event. And we do have a question. Is that if you don't have a burning event, then you don't need to input a yield. That is correct. You don't have to. Some users just like to add that in there so they can dot their I's and cross their T's when they go back and refer to their project later. But you could add 2,000 bushels per acre here, and it's not going to impact your report unless you also add that burning event. How can you check what the system calculates for the yield? So we actually do not have that ability for users because that is a DACENT calculation that happens deep within the nitty-grittiness behind the COMET tools. So unless someone has DACENT training in how to interpret those DACENT files, which you can run DACENT outside of COMET Farm, but we do not have the ability to show users what the yield that DACENT calculates is at this time. And then for the corn silage yields, how could you compare those with the system calculation? Again, users do not have the ability to see what DACENT calculates as the yield. But if you were to run DACENT on your own outside of COMET Farm, which is 10-fold more labor intensive than using COMET Farm, you could see that. Then we've got the question on if you fail to enter grazing, can you save, exit, and then click on grazing and activities? So I'm assuming like if you did not enter grazing in this table, Renee, that you, I'm sorry, could you ask your question?
Sorry, what if you get to this point in the grazing table and it gives you the error warning message like, oh, you didn't do this. Can you then save, go back to the beginning, click that activity, and then continue on?
Yes, you can
Okay.
do that. Yep. And I have had some users, actually a user in Washington State, who their neighbor's cattle grazed their land, so they didn't want to include any emissions associated with the housing or any of the manure emissions that were not deposited on their field. So they did not want to include animal ag because those weren't happening in the boundaries of their farm. So that error message, you can ignore that if you want, but just know that there's limitation in what the Cropland report will tell you. All right, and then Emma, you've got a question of, can you do an example with a biomass crop like corn silage or grass where the yield is not based on bushels? Yes. How about I do that for 2001, and then we can see, actually, I will do that in the drag and drop. So hold on to that thought. I'll show you that. Okay, so we are on the planting and harvest table. Then we can hop to tillage. So if we want to, we need to include here any planting implements. So we're going to add a tillage event, which I do understand. So this says add new tillage event, but this is really just an implement pass, which also includes non-tillage implements. So there is the 6 tillages here, but there's also like growing season cultivation and mow events and herbicides in this as well. If we're going to make the assumption that this person was intensively tilling, which we could leave it as that, we want to make sure that we change the implement date. And what did I say? May 13th. So we want to make sure that this implement, the planting implement, happens the day of plant or before. If you have a tillage event in that, I mean, it ends in the word tillage, that occurs between the day of plant and the day of harvest, the system will assume that you killed your plant. So just make sure that if you add a tillage event that ends in the word tillage, it's not occurring between the day of planting and the harvest date. You can add as many or as few of these as you'd like. And then if you're curious how Comet Farm categorizes each of these tillage events, there's a little blue question mark that tells you about the amount of residue that remains on top for each of these implements or each of these passes, as well as the typical implement that's used. If you do not see something that maybe is happening on your operation, you can send us a summary of your tillage implements, and we can find you one that matches closest to that. So you can click on the top navigation bar, or you can click on the next button down below. But I just don't like scrolling up and down. So now we're on the irrigation page, where you can add in as many or as few irrigation events. You can do, it will default to a single day irrigation event, where the start and end date are the same, and there's no days between your irrigation events. And we've just applied 1 inch for that application, 1 inch of water. Or you could do a range, which likely is not happening in January, but if it was at some other time period. So if this was a full month, maybe you irrigated once per week at about 1 inch per application. So we would want to say once per week is 7 days between each irrigation application. You can add, again, as many or as few as you like. The other option is to have the system auto irrigate for you. So by selecting auto irrigate, there is an automatic or a default setting to the field water holding capacity, which I believe is this might be at wilting point, which you can then change, in which case, once if the water falls below whatever percentage that you're indicating based off of weather data or the precipitation that we're getting from the weather data set, which is the PRISM weather data set that I just put in the chat, then the system will automatically add the water back up to that level that you have indicated. I actually don't see a lot of users using that water holding capacity, I typically see just a range and then an inch per application or whatever it is for the range. I'm not going to add an irrigation event for here because I'm going to do something different when I show that corn silage. Now I'm going to go to the manure and compost application, which you can add as many or as few events as you'd like, in which case you can change the date. You can change the type of manure. As you change the type of manure, the parameters over to the right, which are defaults from USDA, from moisture on, are going to adjust, and then you can adjust how many tons you're adding. Or you can adjust any of these parameters. If, say, you know for a fact you actually have 52% moisture for your compost, you could adjust that. As you change these values in the total amount of nitrogen per acre, the calculator up top will also change. And this is going to be your total nitrogen across your manure page and your fertilizer page. I am going to not add any manure, but you could if you wanted to. Oh, and then the last thing about manure is that we do have quite a few listed in here. But if you don't see the one that you're looking for, you could select other manure and then manually add those parameters in there. I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to say fertilizer application. And again, you can add as many or as few as you'd like. Change the dates by double clicking, change the type by double clicking. And then just like manure, your defaults will also adjust, and then you can change one or the other. If maybe you were adding, I don't know, 130 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you could change that. You could change whatever you want, or you can leave it as it is. You can leave the default values as is. You just cannot change the grayed out boxes. There is also a mixed blends. If you cannot find the one that you're looking for, then you can just enter the total amount of nitrogen. Emmett, you've got a question about autofill input values for additional manure, irrigation, fertilizer applications per crop per year and autofill between crop years. If I'm understanding, Emmett, are you thinking of like if you apply the same type of manure and fertilizer per crop across all years, could you autofill that? Yes. Yes and no. And I hate to say it again, but hold on one second because we're going to get there. If you wanted to do that, so I'm actually just going to, I'm going to leave this as mixed blends. I know this is going to change in a second, but I'm going to put it in for the day of planting. And then I'm going to hop to liming, and you can add liming events if you want. I'm not going to. And then you could add a burning event if you wanted to. I'm not going to. Okay, so Emmett, to get to your second question, when you're on the very last page of any of your crops, so we're on the very last page of our first crop of our first year of our first and only field. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. When I hit next, you're given the option to add an additional crop. This would be for like a cover crop, or if you had multiple crops going in one year just in general. You could add an additional crop for the same year for up to 3 crops per calendar year per field, as long as they do not overlap in planting and harvest date. So if you were working in a situation where you're growing multiple crops in one field, then we might need to be a little creative on how you set up your fields. So if you have a situation like that, feel free to reach out. We're not going to add a cover crop here. We can do that in this scenario. So I'm going to say no thanks. And Emmett, this gets to your question. So say you just had corn growing in this year, and all of the management for the entire baseline was the same as this entire year. So I could copy all of the management from this year, which if we had more than one crop growing in the calendar year, it would include that as well, to other years and or other fields. So if we had more than one field, they would appear below here, and you could copy from this field and year to other fields and years. And that would bring with you the manure, irrigation, fertilizer, and all crop management for all crops in the existing year. And you know what? I'm going to do that because I can show you what will happen if you do something else. So when I did that, the system is going to assume, because I copied it to all years, that all of my crops, well, all of my management for all years is all done. So it's prompting me to move on to the future management, but I actually want to keep editing because I want to show you the drag and drop feature, which, Emmett, you asked about corn silage. So I'm going to do that using this feature. So say you don't know exact management that occurred on your operation, but maybe you know the crop that was growing. Yeah, so maybe you knew just the crop that was growing. So we have the drag and drop crop rotation, which means that we have developed crop templates where we have typical planting and harvest dates, very average across the state. Planting and harvest dates, yields that are, again, only used if you have biomass burning in there. Fertilizer application rates and dates, as well as we will include some default values for, let me just put in corn silage, and I don't know what would be another good one. We can do soybeans. That's my usual go-to. So we can indicate if these were irrigated or not. And then you can also indicate what the tillage was. And the tillage here is going to be like your planting implement, which if you indicate this here, you can always change, you can change anything later at that COMET farm defaults. So I will just leave it as that. But if you notice that I entered all of that corn manually, and then I went back and I did this drag and drop. When I select create rotation, it's going to overwrite everything that I just entered here, which isn't a big deal for me because I intended to do this. But just so you know, if you do this after you have entered management, it will overwrite everything and will populate every other year with our corn silage and soybean management. There we go. And now we've got corn silage, which, because the crop has changed, our units here, the tons per acre has also changed. And I wasn't too far off with my planting date though. So everything has changed. So if we go look at our tillage implements, we do have intensive till, but now we are the day before the new planting date. Our irrigation is set for, I believe, the day of planting up until a month before harvest, and just a week before, or an inch a week for that time period. But again, anything that COMET farm defaults, maybe you think it was definitely every 5 days. You could change anything that COMET farm defaults. We didn't have any manure application. We don't have any manure applications defaults in the drag and drop feature. We just have fertilizer applications. So if you know for a fact it wasn't this type of fertilizer, or maybe they added manure, you could always add that back in. So I'm going to rely on these defaults. Again, we don't have any liming, we don't have any burning. So we're on the very last page of our first year and first crop, but everything is already populated because we just used that drag and drop. So when I hit next, again, I'm prompted if I want to add an additional crop for up to 3 per calendar year. I'm going to say no here because I'm going to do that in a scenario. So I'm going to say no thanks. And now that copy window has little red boxes, and it has little red boxes because that means that there is already management there. So if I was to hit, so 2001, I had soybeans, 2000, I have the corn silage. If I was to select 2001 here and say copy and continue, I'm going to overwrite my soybean management, which if that's what you want to do, you can do it. But just so you know, there's no undoing it, just like deleting a parcel. So I'm going to say no thanks here. And now all of my one field is already filled out. And so we can go on to the future management. But as a side note, there are 22 years of management for the baseline for current COMET farm. We definitely understand, we hear all the users that that is a very long time to get management information for. So if you can at least generate management or gather management for at least the last 10 years, then we would recommend doing that and then copying the last 10 years of management backwards. So like 2013 would go to 2003, and so forth. And the reason being is because when we go to our future management, your report page is going to also include a report on if you continued with the last 10 years of your baseline management, 10 years after the end of the baseline. That way you have if you continue with your original management versus if you continue with your new management, and we're comparing everything on the same timeline. So at least the last 10 years of management. However, if you are not filling out all of the management for what was happening on the ground in all 22 years, it does increase the uncertainty. And the uncertainty that is calculated in COMET farm is under the assumption that you are filling out all of the years that we are asking for as they were on the ground. So let's go to the future management. Okay, so we can do, why don't we do 2 scenarios? So we can do a scenario where we, add a cover crop. And I am going to copy my management from my current situation, because maybe all I wanted to do was say add a cover crop. You can, if you do drag and drop crop rotation, that would only be relevant if you wanted to just change your entire rotation, which I don't want to right now, but you could. You could add a conservation practice, which is what we're going to do in a second. Or you could just start from scratch, which is what the start button is. In which case, if you say start from scratch, then you'll just fill out everything like you just did in the baseline with whatever management change you're looking for. We have this add conservation practice feature to add some automation and reduce your data entry load. There are some caveats with this little window. With this little window, you can only do one at a time. I know it looks like you can do more at a time, and we hope to change that soon. But you can only do one practice at a time. So maybe we are just adding cover crops, and you can select your cover crop. Maybe we are adding clover. So you could do these other options. And then when I select add, it's going to automatically add. Well, now it thinks we're done because you could be done right now, but I'm going to keep editing to show you. Now we have added a cover crop to all of our years for our single field. The other caveat with this little window was that you can only do it one field at a time. It does not apply to all of your fields. So if we had 20 fields in here, you'd have to do it to each individual field, which I understand is a bummer. And we are hoping to fix that in the new redesign. The other bummer is that if you say I now have here, we'll practice. If we want to create a new scenario, which you can have up to 10 scenarios to compare to your original management, you could select new here and say create new scenario. Maybe we want to do plus cover crop, a no-till plus cover crop. You can copy your management from one of your other scenarios, but unfortunately, if you say add a conservation practice, it's going to take the management from your baseline and apply that conservation practice regardless of what you select here, which I understand is confusing. And we are working to fix that. So I want to not add this conservation practice, and I'm just going to manually add that no-till. So I'm going to say, copy this from my cover. And I chose to manually add the no-till because it's less labor intensive than adding a cover crop. So now, because I copied it from one scenario to another, these two scenarios are identical right now. So I need to go and make this change on my no-till and cover crop. So I'm going to go to my soybean and I'm going to go to the tillage page and I'm going to manually change this to no-till. Then I'm going to go to my clover, my tillage, and manually change that to no-till. Now I'm going to be lazy and not click through every page here. So I'm going to scroll down and say skip ahead, which will prompt me to add another crop, which I don't want to in this scenario. One cover is enough for me at the moment. So I'm going to say no thanks. And now I'm going to copy all of my management from 2003 with the soybean and clover to every other year. And I'm going to overwrite the management that is already there. So I'm going to say copy and continue, which I can be done now. However, in my scenario, I said this is a no-till and cover crop. And while every year has a cover crop, I did not change my corn silage tillage yet. So I'm going to hop to my corn silage page and go check on my tillages. And that is still intensive till because I copied from this plus cover scenario. So I'm going to change that to no-till. I'm going to hop to clover and change that to no-till. And I'm going to do the exact same thing and be lazy and say skip ahead because that's the only thing I want to change is the tillage. I say skip ahead. And I don't want to add another crop, but you could if you wanted to. And so now I'm going to copy this corn silage and clover to every other year, overwriting everything that is already there. So now I'm just going to keep editing to show you what's there. Now all of my tillage implements are no-tills. I can just hop around and pick random ones, spot checking, and they all are no-tills. So unfortunately, there's no easy way. Well, I guess I could just hop to the report, but typically you would need to do what we just did, which is the skip ahead. No, I don't want to add an extra crop. No, I don't want to copy anything now. I'm done copying. So I say, no, thanks. Sorry, it sounds like someone's moving something outside of my office right now. So we could create a new scenario up to 10. You could keep editing, or we could go to the report, which is what we're going to do now. And now we're going to send all of that management that we just entered. Dacent is going to take the soil data from Sergo, the weather data from Prism, and input all of the management and all of those details into Dacent and those empirical models that are outlined in the blue book to generate a report. However, this is going to take, my guess is about a minute and a half. And so the more fields, the more map units, the more scenarios you have, the longer it will take to generate a report. If your report takes longer, well, if you have a lot of fields, if you just have one field, it should take no more than 2 minutes. But no report should take longer than 15 to 20 minutes. And that's assuming that you have maxed out the number of fields. So if that happens, and you are sitting here for more than 15 to 20 minutes, please hit the rerun button or refresh your page. And if it's still not working, then send us a message here. So while we're waiting on this to generate, does anyone have any questions so far?
Haley, I think I didn't cover this quite well enough at the beginning. I was realizing, but so when folks applied for sustainable farms and fields, most people used the Washington Climate Smart Estimator tool, which runs COMET Planner in the background. And could you just explain, because I think you'll do a better job than I will, sort of the difference between COMET Planner and COMET Farm?
Yes.
In brief.
Yes. So actually, let me bring up I think I have. Let me bring up my introduction slides. Go over those. Oh my goodness, too many table or too many tabs. So COMET Planner was created as a simpler tool for regional assessments to give users the general idea of conservation planning practice impacts on their emissions at a regional, and by regional, we're thinking of a county rectified major land resource area. And so what COMET Planner does is we did all the modeling ahead of time, so users can just select what those conservation practices are. So to do that, we selected random cropland and grassland points from every 285 major land resource areas around the US to develop crop rotations back to 2008 for each of those points. So then we took additional survey data in terms of typical fertilizer application rates and dates and whether or not it was irrigated or those regions were irrigated or not, and run that fixed baseline through the COMET Farm API, which means that we're still pulling on spatial data in terms of the soil types and the weather data and historic cropping rotations like we would in COMET Farm when you're entering that historic management details. However, this is all fixed based off of the sample points that were generated and run through the COMET Farm API. And then for each of those conservation practices that are listed in COMET Planner, we ran each of those on every region within all of those fixed baselines in order to be able to provide you with that quick on-the-fly analysis. And so COMET Planner, all you have to do is define your county and your state, which conservation practice you'd like to apply and how that is implemented in terms of if it's on a cropland or a pasture or if it's irrigated or not, and then just entering the size. However, you are getting a county estimate and it's not going to be field specific. Whereas in COMET Farm, you're tying all of the models and the management to the specific map units that are within wherever you define your fields.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. There we go. Okay. So, okay, so this took longer than I thought it would. This took about 4 minutes to generate a report. And so with your COMET Farm reporting page, we will be improving this in the new redesign later this year. But at the moment, this is the best that we have, where we've got our fields defined vertically. And then when you extend each of those, you can view the source and subsource categories. I'll close those. And then we have our scenarios going across the x-axis up top. If you had more than one scenario, they're going to appear, or more than two scenarios, they're going to appear over here. There are occasionally this bottom scroll bar will disappear. If that happens, just refresh your page. You should be okay. And within each of the scenarios, there's a column for the emissions associated with that scenario, which I'll get into that in a second. There's an uncertainty column. And then for any defined scenarios, in our case, the adding cover and then the no-till plus cover, there's a change compared to the baseline. So what these values actually mean is that for this first column, all of our estimates are going to be summarized in terms of metric tons of CO2e. And that is the average annual metric tons of CO2e over the 10-year scenario period. So this first column for baseline emissions, I mentioned earlier for each of our scenarios, or for the future scenario, we're going to be comparing everything to the last 10 years of the baseline management. So these baseline emissions are the average annual metric tons of CO2e over a 10-year period if you continued with the last 10 years of your baseline management for 10 years after the baseline time period, so, or 10 years into the future, which viewing it as the future is kind of, that's kind of difficult sometimes if you change your baseline management, but in this case, it is the future. And so a positive value is going to indicate emissions, whereas a negative value is going to indicate a reduction in emissions or an increase in carbon sequestered, which is a little bit easier to picture in the change column. And so by adding cover crops, which I think I might know why this might have an increase, by adding our cover crops with the clover here, we are seeing an increase in emissions or a reduction in carbon sequestered by 0.8 metric tons of CO2e annually over that 10-year period. Whereas if we look at the adding no-till plus cover crop, we're seeing a reduction in emissions or an increase in carbon sequestered because we have a -5 here. So we're seeing a reduction in emissions by 5 metric tons of CO2e annually, just in soil carbon, or 5.6 total metric tons of CO2e annually for reducing our tillage and adding a cover crop. You can view, there is, oh, it's gonna freeze on me. Yeah. Sometimes it freezes on me. So if it freezes, you can just refresh it. There we go. So we do have uncertainty associated, an uncertainty calculation, which is defined in Chapter 8 of the Blue Book document for the source categories and subsource categories outside of direct N2O and soil carbon. Those should be available when the new redesign is available, so in the fall of this year. But you can click on the little histogram and you'll get a bigger histogram that explains how Comet Farm uses the Monte Carlo method in order to estimate that uncertainty. And then the other thing that is on the reports is we do have a graphical report, which is broken down by field. And then this is going to, the values here are going to be associated with the first column, the emissions column for each scenario that you can hover over to get more information. You can print or save these graphics if you would like. And then we do also have an available water holding capacity report that is broken down by field and by map unit. And so if I just shrink this, so by adding a covered crop and reducing our tillage, we are potentially, it's an estimate, improving our available water holding capacity by 386 gallons per acre. However, I'm not entirely sure what the interactions that are happening with just cover crop here. I would have to do some investigating as to why we're seeing a loss of available water holding capacity due to adding just a cover crop. But I can investigate that too. Let's see. Do we have any questions on the report?
Is
I
that
guess-
water holding capacity a new feature, or has that been around for a while?
Yes, well, relatively new. So that's been around since September, the update in September of last year.
Hadn't seen it before. Thanks.
Yeah. Renee, did you have a question as well?
I probably need to read my emails first to see what numbers we need to enter for all of our projects. But Karen probably put that in one of the emails, and I need to look at the example spreadsheet she sent too.
And
Yeah.
I was going to say too, yeah, that was what I was going to talk about, that Excel spreadsheet that Haley brought up, and that it's in the chat and then an email I sent earlier. So this is kind of a tool for collecting some of that baseline management data. So hopefully this will make it easier to collect it on the spreadsheet and then go in and enter it at a later time in COMET Farm.
Yeah.
And in terms of your kind of like what to do for what projects, Renee, I know some folks on this call have multiple projects going on. I'm happy to circle back with you directly or anybody else with kind of project specifics, and we can talk more about that. I think there's going to be a lot of situations where, you know, kind of choosing a representative field makes a lot of sense, like equipment sharing projects. You're not going to obviously do this for every field that a piece of equipment is going to be used on, but kind of putting in some representative rotations for your area, I think is kind of what we're looking for. So happy to talk directly with anybody later about sort of project specific details.
We also have, which Karen, I don't know if I sent this to you, but we do have a step-by-step guide on how to create a cropland project. So everything I just showed you all, we have that also links helpful articles and provide screenshots on each step. So we have this available for cropland and dairy, beef, and swine as well, and agroforestry coming soon. And then just as a side note about the this Excel data sheet, Karen, did I send you both the Excel version and the Google Sheets version?
I don't think I have the Google Sheets version.
Okay, I will send that too, just in case someone likes one or the other. There is a downfall of them, is that it really is just an organization tool and cannot be uploaded to COMET Farm at this time, unfortunately. And then another note on the export or on the COMET Farm report, there is we have an interpreting your cropland report button at the very bottom, and that breaks down each section of the report, as well as just a side note on what that baseline is that we're reporting on and how to view your graphical report.
And I might be able to take a stab at Brad's question about why adding a cover crop might have increased emissions in the scenario that Haley ran. Just because we did some work with Descent and cover crops with a postdoc that was working with me in my last job. And I think my guess is that it's because it's a legume. And I think that, if I recall correctly, I think that does sometimes happen with the legume cover crops, that sometimes it does actually bump up the emissions. Is that your understanding, Haley, or have you run into that before?
So that could be part of the reason, which is definitely why we're seeing an increase in the direct N2O emissions. However, just as a side note, this is on the per field basis. So we're only seeing that 0.2 increase in, that's just 0.2 direct N2O emissions for the entire 10 acres annually. So it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much. But another thing that could have happened, which I would need to go look at the weather files for this specific area, is that there's a chance that the cover crops, depending on how much we had let's see, the corn silage was irrigated, but I had selected no irrigation for the soybeans and added the cover crop there. So there is a chance that that cover crop would be using the available water that is just residual in the land. That would be typically available for the other crops because I did not irrigate the soybeans. So what we could do, let's see. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to add an additional scenario on here. And see what happens when I add no-till plus cover crop plus irrigated soybeans, which I'm doing very shorthand because I only have 25 character limitation here. So it's very helpful to keep track of what you're implementing. So I'm going to say no-till and cover crop and then create new scenario. And now I'm going to go to my soybeans. And I'm going to go to irrigation. Actually, I don't know when these are planted. Okay, so last week of May to October. So let's see what happens when I add in an irrigation event until I'm going to say September 26th. And we're going to keep it an inch per week. And so that's the only thing that I wanted to change, and I don't feel like clicking through everything else. So I'm just going to copy this management to every other soybean year. Copy and continue. And so I'm going to go to the report. Unfortunately, we do have to wait another minute for this to generate because we have now told the system there's more management to calculate. So we'll see what happens then. Because I had a project a few weeks ago in northern Colorado, which we do not get a lot of water here. And someone added a cover crop and it drastically reduced their soil carbon value. And looking into how that would impact Dason is that any available water would be split between two crops now, which would reduce the overall growth of both crops. So we'll see what happens. Any other questions while we're waiting on this?
I'm curious about, this is, I guess, a question for the group. Who has done any sort of COMET farm training in the past? You can give me a hands up. Let's see, one. I think there's a learning curve with any of these tools, especially if you're not using them regularly, but Brad has too. I know I've taken a COMET farm training in the past and then promptly didn't use it for a long time. So it's kind of like a refresher.
Well, I've been using COMET almost daily for the past 3 years, and I just learned something new today. So never ending. All right. There we go. All right. So so you can actually, oh, whoops. I'm so sorry. I did a scenario where I should have actually done not no-till. Oh my goodness. I should have done plus cover, but kept it as intensive till. Whereas I did no-till plus cover crop plus irrigating the soybeans. But we can see that did improve. We've reduced our emissions or increased our soil carbon sequestration by 1.8 metric tons of CO2e per field per year. So I imagine that the irrigation on the soybeans or the lack thereof is also contributing to this 0.8 increase in emissions here. But I did not do a proper test there. Yeah. Well, are there any other questions or anything else someone would like me to demonstrate?
Quiet group. Everybody's taking it all in. I guess I just wanted to, feel free to chime in with questions as they occur, but just to generally say, this may all be a little overwhelming if you have not used Comet Farm before. Take a deep breath. We're going to get through this together, and Haley is super helpful and has those great office hours for basically any, I think it was every week, right?
Yep.
You have those. Are those like a register first, or is it drop in?
It's a register just once, and then you can
Okay.
drop to any of them.
Okay. Yeah. And as there are specific questions about your projects and how to sort of navigate through the details and complexities of the projects in terms of using Comet Farm, feel free to reach out. I think probably the first step for a lot of folks is just collecting that as much of that baseline management data as possible.
Yes. Yeah, so feel free to reach out anytime. You guys will have my email after this, or you might already. Hop on any office hours or reach out through the need help widget. We're here to help. Andy, who's also on the call, she's available too. So we've got a whole army of people to help you out.
Hey, thanks so much, Haley. And we'll be posting this on the CTD website, along with links to the Cropland data Excel spreadsheet and Google Sheet for folks to use.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Feel free to reach out either to myself or Haley as questions occur. Thanks,
All right.
Haley.
Thank you. Have a good one.